I think I just remembered, but if you guys were observant, you would know. And the missing thing is, yes, the RAM. And I shouldn't have put that one on top first. It's impossible to put that bottom one in second. So okay, we're going to mount the RAM back in. Put this cover back on. Then the only thing we should have left is the hinge cover plate, the plate covering the wireless adapter. Throw the battery back in, and I think we're in business. Get the wireless cover back on there. Dust it off first. Those covers get real dusty. You'd be surprised how much dust comes off of them. If the dust is too thick, I don't use the paintbrush because I don't want to get the paintbrush too messed up. I just use a wet dry vac with the brush attachment. Okay, let's put this cover back on, the hinge plate cover. Or the hinge cover plate. Sorry. Now in this laptop, I believe there's 2 screws holding that plate in from the back once we get it on there. They go right over the hinge covers. Just snap these in. Sometimes they take a little maneuvering, but they will eventually go in, and they need to lay flush. They need to lay exactly how it was before you took it off. And you'll know where it is because there won't be any lumps in it. Let's get these 2 screws on that hold those hinge covers on. It's another thing you want to be careful of. You don't want to go prying that hinge cover plate off knowing that there's screws holding it in from the back because you're going to break it. So always check for those screws holding it in from the back. Gateways are famous for having them. Maybe Acers. Old HPs have them. Not too many other models have them that I know of. Now, before we plug anything in, I always like, if we do a major power jack repair, I always like to test to see if there's any short circuits before I plug anything in. I don't want to fry anything. So I'm going to touch the center pin with the red connector, and I'm going to touch a ground point with the black lead here. That's actually the other way around. It does not matter if you're doing testing continuity. The black plate is actually going to touch the middle pin. And there was no short circuit, meaning there was no beep. If we heard a beep, we'd know we'd be in trouble. Now we're going to take the power adapter and we're going to plug it in and test this thing out. And we're getting nothing. Why are we getting nothing? Time to diagnose now. Let's test the power adapter. And we're getting 20 volts or 19 volts. You couldn't see it, but the power adapter appears to be working. So let's plug the battery in and see what's going on. I'm pretty confident we did the repair okay on the power jacks, so there's got to be something else going on here. Let's see if it charges the battery. We got the power adapter in there. We're going to jiggle the power adapter. See if that makes any difference. Still not powering on. Now here's a little bit of a revelation. I skipped forward a little bit. With the power adapter in there, we got the battery light charging. When we move it the slightest bit, it goes off. Once we jiggle it and let it sit, it goes back on. Computer power's on. Everything seems to be fine. So I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. What's wrong with the power jack is the inside tip of the power jack is very worn. The tip is bad, and the hole, which is on the inside of the power adapter, just became too big through all the use and damage and whatnot. And it's so big now that it's not making a connection when we plug it into the power jacks. The power jack's okay. It's just a loose power adapter now. So what we're going to do is replace the tip on the power adapter. So as you can see here, I cut off the tip of the power adapter, the existing tip, and I already stripped out the wires. We have one that's bare and one shielded with white shielding there. The white shielding one is the positive, the unshielded one's negative. This is a Radio Shack adapter plug, size N, which fits the gateway. We're going to mount it just like that. First thing we want to do, because I always forget to do this, is put some heat shrink tubing over the wire. I use a real thick one to cover the adapter plug, and then I use a thinner one under there to actually shield the wires, as you'll see shortly. Cut a decent size for that. I'm going to pull out the helping hands here, which will hold the wires for me while I do some soldering. The thick heat shrink tubing goes over first. And what I'm going to do now is sand down the posts on this adapter plug. See, the adapter plugs are meant to be plugged into a different adapter, not for wires to be soldered onto the bare pins there. But I found it makes a good repair on a power adapter. You could buy the Radio Shack adapter that it plugs into and then just solder the wires together, but I found the wires in that adapter that this adapter plug plugs into are a little too thin. So I like to go right from the power adapter wires right into the adapter plug. It's not pretty all the time, but it'll work. And you can see I scuffed up the pins there. We're going to put it in the helping hands. We're going to drop some solder on there. I always seem to get this a little out of frame, don't I? And there we have it. Solder is dropped on there securely because we scuffed it. The solder's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to break off. And what I'm going to do now is drop some solder on the ends of these wires. I call it tinning. Coat those wires in solder. And then when you're ready, we just touch those two wires to the adapter plug, heat them up, and solder should melt together on both ends. Now these wires are copper already. We don't have to sand the wires down. The solder is going to melt right into the copper. And there's a little too much exposed on one end. I'm going to cut it a little short. There might be some stray wires hanging off the edge. Just make sure everything's nice and clean. You don't want any short circuit here. And this is the product we're going to get. Camera doesn't like to focus unless I put my hand as a background, so there you have it. Now we need a little bit of a thinner wire to go under the wide heat shrink tubing. And you'll see how this works after we get everything on there. Well, we found a good piece of heat shrink tubing that'll fit over the inside wires there. Cut it to a reasonable size. Slip it on before you do any soldering to the adapter plug, otherwise it will not fit. Okay, we're going to get out the voltmeter here. And we're going to just find out which pin is positive and which pin is negative on the adapter plug. Because on the power adapter, that one with the white shielding is positive and the one that's bare is negative. That's your ground. So we just need to make sure they get matched up properly. And we went ahead and soldered those wires now to the adapter plug. Just finishing that up. And I want to hold it in front of the camera and show you exactly what we did. And this is our product at this point. It's very important that those two wires are not touching, or any frayed part of the wire is touching the other part of the wire. It will create a direct short circuit, and we don't want that. Let's do a little cleaning up here. I'm going to do a little cleaning up. It's a smart thing to do. When you're done working with your tools and materials, put them back in the same spot you got them in. Don't just keep a big pile. Keep your space clean. You can get more done that way. Now what we're going to do is take some electrical tape here, and we're going to wind it around those wires that we just soldered, just to make sure that they stay separated and they're insulated. And I'll show you what I'm doing as soon as we get that back in the frame. We got the electrical tape around the two wires, and then we pushed up the heat shrink tubing over those two wires. The smaller heat shrink tubing, and then we take the thicker heat shrink tubing and we put it over the adapter plug. Now we're going to take our voltmeter before we do anything, and before we seal up the heat shrink tubing, and test the power adapter. Make sure that we're getting the proper voltage through it. And it goes right to about 19 volts, which is what we want, so we know our connections are okay. Now, because I don't have a heat gun or a lighter, I'm actually going to use the barrel of my soldering iron to melt the heat shrink tubing. Not the most optimum thing to do in the world, but it's workable in a bind, and it gives you a nice even, shrinking of the tubing, which is what we want. So once we get the inner part melted, we do the same thing to the outer part. Try not to keep the soldering iron on the heat shrink tubing at one place one time. For too long, it'll burn, and it won't smell real good either. I'm going to speed this up for you guys. Okay, that took a little while, but we're getting close, and this is going to be our finished product. Nicely shrunken. 2 layers of heat shrink tubing with the electrical tape on the inside. That came out pretty good. That's one of my better jobs, I must say. And those things are soldered direct to those posts. They're not going to go anywhere. It's a pretty secure connection. Now, what I'm about to do next might seem a little crazy. I'm actually going to cut that whole tip off of this power adapter. In between the footage here, I tested that power adapter again, and I found out the power brick itself was actually bad, not putting out the proper voltage. So since we already installed a tip, got all the heat shrink tubing done, we're just going to install this tip on another power adapter. Now this other power adapter actually has a bad tip itself, so we're going to take the good tip that we just created and solder it directly onto this new power adapter. And what we do with this is, we cut the wire, then we separate the ground from the positive. Get that old power adapter out of the way. Throw that in the trash. Okay. We're actually going to plug this in now and test the voltage. Make sure you do not touch the two wires together, positive and negative, while you're doing this. Got our voltmeter out. We have our exposed wires there, not touching each other. We're going to take the black to the ground, red to the positive, which is the white. Check the meter. We're getting 19 volts. We're going to unplug that power adapter. We don't want any voltage running to this while we're working on it. I did that once. It wasn't fun. Caused a rather large spark. And now I'm going to strip the other end. Solder these two pieces together. We'll be golden. Again, it's smart to use a wire cutter in that situation, but if you don't have one laying around, you could use a regular pair of cutters there, as long as you don't cut the wire. Okay, once you get that exposed, twist it so no fray wires are hanging out. Okay, we're going to use the helping hands here, and we're going to tin the ends of these wires. Now, the camera didn't quite catch it, but what happened was I tinned the sides of all the exposed wires. Now I'm going to throw some heat shrink tubing over it. Cut it to the right size. Now we're going to solder the two ends together. And because the camera's not picking it up, I will show you the finished product. Okay, there's the cable sitting right there with the heat shrink tubing over it. Now we're going to test it out in this machine and make sure everything works. Now we plug the AC adapter in. Pull out the voltmeter and do one last check just to make sure there's no short circuit and we're getting the right voltage. And we're okay. No beeps, and we were getting 19 volts. Or 18.5, somewhere around there. Plug the power adapter in. Since there's no battery, there's not going to be any charging light, but there is the power.